Welcome back to another SCX24 build, and today I'm going to be building up my third Jeep Gladiator. So you can see here on the table I've got quite a bit laid out. So this stage one is going to focus on basically the chassis, getting that built up, hopefully getting it moving, getting the electronics in, and being able to take a look at trimming this body up potentially. So this is going to situate around this Injora LCG carbon fiber chassis. So this is new to me. Figured that'd be a good thing to try out, pretty affordable. So we'll see what that's all about. And then I've got this 4100 kV BAM motor from Mofo RC, and that's a bad boy. But because of that, I'm going to gear that down with Mofo's Portals. So those are 25% gear reducted, and I'm going to install those, at least the fronts, on CCXRC's brass axle. So I've got a little more brass here, got a Mofo Servo Beast, and then I've got these RC Addiction Jeep Gladiator brass links. I didn't end up using those on a prior build, so got those spare. I'm trying out this new OGRC flat skid, so we'll see what that's all about. I've got a fully built metal transmission to go with that BAM motor. And I also picked up some metal Gladiator drive shafts, so that ought to secure the drive line for that kind of power. As far as the gearing, we're going to further gear down the rear with, I think this is a 30% underdrive. And then we're going to overdrive the front for a little more speed, and I believe that 13T is about 15%. Another new item for me here is these Injora Oil Shocks. So I've had these for a little while, so waiting to try those out. And then these little guy sliders, I haven't used these before, so we'll see if we can get those to work with this custom frame. And then a final thing here, I used the JLU version of these Club 5 inner fenders before on a Gladiator, but now they actually make these for the Gladiator. So we're also going to see if I can adapt those to work with this frame as well. Always like to have inner fenders for a little more scale detail. But for the keen eye, you may have noticed a pretty neat little scale detail already installed. So we're going to take a closer look at that. All right, you are looking at one of very few handmade styrene cages, and this is by ROCKWOLF Design. So he sent me this out, good friend of mine, and that is what this Gladiator is going to center around, this rack. And I got to tell you, this thing is just super cool. I was super impressed. It just bolted right up to all the stock locations. You can see here, you just remove the tent and the crossbars, you relocate that tent up front, and it just bolts right on to the existing side racks. And then what I don't have installed, there's 2 screw holes, so you'll basically drill up and screw these in from below. But there's 2 little divots on the hood that the screw holes line up with, so just perfect. Such a cool rack. It's got that slope kind of with the tent, so puts some of that weight forward instead of all of it back here. But that is kind of the impetus for me doing another Gladiator. And you may be wondering, well, if you're replacing almost every part, why'd you buy a Gladiator? That is a good question. I mean, we're going to be replacing the body as well. The reason is I wanted some V2 electronics for another project that I've already used quite a while back, and then you can see I've stolen the transmission, used that on the build, so it's not like I'm not getting usage out of these parts. I do end up using pretty much all the pieces somewhere, you know, of course minus some of the junk pieces like the steering links and things no one uses. But anyways, enough said about that. This build is kind of bounced back and forth as far as what it wants to be in my mind. I had a really clear vision, and then I've kind of altered that a little and tweaked it, and I'm kind of bouncing back and forth on wheels and tires, and I was kind of waffling on portals or not. But I think I'm going to go ahead and start with the portals. But I think it's time to jump in. So let's take a look at that chassis. Okay, I've got this carbon fiber frame laid out, and pretty simple here. It gives you quite a few options. You get 2 of these slotted trays that are the same, so they've got the insert on one end, so you can flip them either direction. you've got cutouts for battery straps, and then you get this little narrow cross piece as well. So there's 2 slots. You can lower these down. You could actually remove this, flip it back flat. So there's quite a few options. You've got a cross mount back here. So unfortunately, they just give you 3 of these. You've got more positions to use them, but they just slot in, you know. And then the hardware beyond that is, you know, some screws, some micro nuts, and you get aluminum cross pieces as well. But no instructions. It's just build as you want. You get a Velcro battery strap, which is nice, and you get some Velcro for the front, which I'm not going to be using. And then no skid, of course. So I've got this OGRC flat skid, which is nice. Kind of a missed opportunity here. I don't know why these companies don't just make this slot further across and put another mount here and 2 more holes just to make, you know, be able to flip the transmission without demounting this guy. But other than that, it looks like you have to mount the lower links before you install this. So there's like a deep hole here. So you would put your screws down there, install it, and then the frame is going to cover that, those screws. So you can't get at those once it's installed. So that's a negative. If you ever need to remove them, you've got to drop the skid. Then of course it's got your upper link mounts sticking out here, the tabs. But this frame, of course, because it is LCG, it gives you multiple link riser positions. So you could always chop those off. We'll see if they get in the way. You know, if I end up racing the link, I'm not going to actually need them at all. But for a stock rig, you would need these. So anyways, that's kind of the layout of the chassis. And you can kind of see the difference here on the stock. It kind of gives you a better break over here, lowers everything down a little bit. The front looks similar, gives you more shock options, you know, of course, and raises those up to let you drop the whole frame. Looks like the skid is flat. It might be, I think it is. I think this thing is sitting flat, so I don't think there's any angle right here to the bottom of that chassis. But for the price point, this is great. I mean, I think this is under 20 bucks, so super cheap. So figured I'd try it out and just see if we could work with it. And so hopefully the scale fenders and kind of the more scale items are still going to be able to bolt up. Hopefully they've got some keyholes. If not, I may have to drill a few, but we shall see. Well, can you tell what the first hiccup of the build is? Another strange occurrence. So if you look at these skids, they should not be the same. They should be mirrored. So they have provided me 2 of the same side skids in one package. So I'm gonna have to get with little guy and get that sorted. But you can't do much with that. You kind of need them to match. So one thing I did notice before I realized I had 2 of the same was just how these install. So these want to install with these 2 screw holes here, that on this chassis they're really not going into anything if we use this flat skid, because we're putting in recessed screws in this hole. So there's nothing for those to bite. Typically they would install and bite where the transmission actually mounts the plate, and then of course your lowers are actually under that. So now we've raised the lowers, put them in that spot so there's not that plastic for it to bite, or metal in this case. But it looks like these holes are large enough and deep enough so you could potentially install the links with the screw set, you know, all the way in the hole. And then I think you could probably install these guys with a shorter screw through this frame and back it up with a micro nut. And then you can install this after the fact, and the micro nuts would slip in these holes. They're small enough, I've tested. So that looks like that would work. Look at that finish, it's all jacked up there. So it looks like there's a potential to be able to use these sliders with the flat skid on this frame, just depending on having 2 opposite sliders. So for now, little guy sliders are out, and I think the next thing is to kind of focus on getting the transmission in and the motor, and I think the motor is going to want to be forward, so it's going to take this tray out. So this tray may go to one of these back positions, but I think that's the first thing, is I'm going to have to get a couple links in here, get that on, get the motor in, and kind of figure out the layout of the frame overall, and we can go from there. So you can see I've got the BAM out, and I've got this aluminum motor mount from Mofo RC to go with it, and then this is the nice fully assembled little guy transmission, nice and smooth here. And they do provide a pinion and a couple of motor screws for brush motors to go into this motor plate. So we're going to lose the cover, we're going to lose the motor plate, and we're going to replace it with this motor mounting plate. Get that all together, get it on, and then we'll start seeing how this chassis shapes up. Well, made a little progress here, and as you can see, I didn't end up using this OGRC flat skid. Went ahead and got this all mounted up to a plastic stock transmission skid, and the more I thought about this and just the features of it, the more it just didn't seem very well suited for this build. You know, since I'm not going to be able to use those sliders right now, I'm going to have to install those later. Removing these two screws and installing that will be super easy. Otherwise, I would have to pull apart both chassis rails to be able to install those and back them up with micro nuts. I mean, it would have been a full disassembly to add those back later. The other things, I guess, are more about how this mounts. So if I line it up here over those screws where it mounts, it's like, okay, you do get the flat skid, right? So it raises the skid maybe 3 millimeters of clearance, but you can see the peg here for that third screw, how high that is. Because it's flat, it's also really raising up this whole motor transmission assembly. So this is so much lower. So this is probably 6 millimeters lower than it would be on this skid, and you're only gaining maybe 3 millimeters of clearance by using the flat. So because this motor is so heavy, I'd rather have the whole assembly lower. So another reason to use this plastic one is I can snip it really easily if I want to use these link riser positions and these are in the way or whatever. Super easy to modify the plastic housing. So all in all, I think I'm just going to save this for a build that it may work better for with a lighter motor. This thing weighs so much, I'd just rather keep it low. So one more tip on installing this stock transmission. So it's got the little plastic pegs here that go in those two center holes. There was just no way to get those in and get it to lay flush at all. So I had to use, you know, X-Acto in the holes on both sides and just kind of whittle them out to open those up to get it to seat. So you'll probably have to do something similar to that. But for the price point, that is kind of expected. So this looks good to go. I've got a little wiggle here with the pinion to the spur. So we have to get that tested. I have tested this motor before and it runs great, so do want to test it before we get the whole truck assembled though, make sure the mesh is good, everything is proper. But I think the next thing is get this rail on, and then we'll see where we go from there. All right, we have entered the chop shop. The body's off the frame is off the axles, and I've got the new frame assembled up to the transmission skid, ready to go. So we are about ready to do an axle swap. So we've got those stock plastic axles, and I've got all these goodies here that we're going to swap over. So the big thing that I'm interested in getting into here are these V2 portal knuckles and drive cups. So we're going to pull those out and just really see what the difference is between that and the V1s. But we've got a little bit of work ahead of us, so let's jump in. Okay, we've got the full portal assembly laid out here, and so the V2 components are the ones on the left here. So the first difference in these knuckles is the finish. This one on the left is definitely a different finish, a little brighter. For the drive cups, I know what the difference is. They have this little kind of cut-in edge now instead of being flat. So that's supposed to help at full lock, maybe eliminate some of the binding and bucking. So that's different versus these just being a straight cut at the end. I'm noticing these come with O-rings. So I've used those before as well, the little worm gear O-rings on the end of these stub shafts. There's a little play on these in the portal box in and out, and so that has helped me before to shim that to alleviate some binding. And then the other difference, I believe, there's a difference maybe in some hole alignment. I don't know if that's the top and bottom knuckle holes where it mounts on the arm, or if it's this output hole. But I believe something has been tweaked, just very minor, to help with some alignment. And then the last thing is the steering arm. It is now, I think, in the correct position because it's not marred from being reshaped. And it looks like it's a little thinner profile. So we'll look at one of these original ones. So these all shipped with the wrong angle, so you can see they all had to be grabbed by a tool and hand bent to the right angle, so they're all marred. And it does look like that's a little thicker arm, but that's a pretty minor difference there. So I'm curious to see with these V2 knuckles installed if there's you know, if that helps that front end. It's usually not a big thing. I've got two sets of portals and they both work fine, but both of them, the front end, I believe at least on one side only, took a little troubleshooting to alleviate some rotational binding and a little shimming to keep the dog bone, you know, from popping out of that slot. So hopefully these little tweaks will alleviate that and make this a smoother install. But these are definitely not like a beginner upgrade. But I do like the ones I have. I think they're great. I like the reduction. So anyways, we're gonna pull out the rest of this stuff and get it arranged, and we'll get these together. We have a little progress here on the front axle, so I wanted to stop here and just test it. So had no issues with this brass CCXRC housing, great fitment. The bearing pressing into the diff cover, you know, was super tight. You had to go, you know, basically straight on. It took me a minute to get it all lined up square. The inner axle bearing back here for the driveline just dropped right in. So anyways, no fitment issues, didn't have to Dremel anything. The tray went on, this is all tightened down. So as of now, I just have the inners in, put a little udder butter grease in there, but you definitely want to kind of test it at stages. So no issues there. And that is both O-rings on the worm gear on that Injora overdrive. So everything is super smooth, really happy with that. So no issues so far. And you can see here, I went ahead and added some washers. I don't think I had those laid out on the table, but dug through my little spacer washers and had some little guys. So I recommend that versus O-rings because these won't expand and pop off since it's a hard washer. But anyway, so now we know there's no issues there. It's time to attack this portal kit. Okay, I just want to take a quick second as I'm getting into these portal boxes and these V2 stub axles or drive cups. Now that I'm looking at it and thinking about it, I bet these little O-rings were included as the inner cup O-rings. But like I say, I've had to use them on the end, you know, right here, because you can see there's no retainer on these. You know, they pop in their little hole there, but they can usually come in and out like that. So that's been the issue I've had before. And I don't know if it's on both sides, but at least on one. But I think for now I'm going to install it. I'm going to grease them up and install it without that on the end and just put it on the drive cup, put it inside as normal. But good fitment, very precise. So I'm going to get a little grease in there and get these on. Well, a little update on these portal boxes and knuckles. So one side of these went together just like butter. No issues, fully tightened down. I mean, not cranked and crushed, but tightened down, good friction fit. Flush against the knuckle, little grease in there, just wonderful. Of course, that was the first one I did. The second one gave me all kinds of issues. I swapped the portal box out, Portal box wasn't the issue. The issue is the connection to the knuckle. You can see there's a little bit of a gap there. It seemed like when these two are tightened down and compressed flat against the knuckle, there's a little binding. So I'm guessing there's a little bit of a hole alignment that's off, either the two screw holes or the center hole. But the solution was backing them all out evenly a little bit and then kind of tightening them in a cross pattern. And as soon as I felt some binding, I'd back it off. But look at that, I mean, it's even wiggling right there. So I think I'm going to use some Loctite. I may play with this a little more, but right now the function is there. I just don't want the assembly to come apart. But it's a little, can't tell if I'm wiggling that or if it's wiggle, but anyways, this may be solved, but apparently the V2 knuckle, it's still that problem on this same side. So I don't know what the deal is, but anyways, that's why these are not for beginners, and you want to do them in kind of stages like this and check your work. So I'm going to do a little more finagling with this until I'm happy, and then we're going to move forward. Okay, second update on these front knuckles. So it's a little bit of a on-off to get this guy fitted on here and functioning pretty well. What I found was that the drive cup slot was too tight and it was catching the pin, so I got my Dremel wheel down there, and I also kind of deepened it and rounded the end of it there. So you can see there, that one's kind of flared, opened up quite a bit. So that helped. I also swapped the O-ring to this output shaft here, and you can see that shims it inward so it doesn't sit flush. So that again helped push this whole drive cup inward and hold that pin better. It spins okay. I wouldn't say binding, but there is kind of a, like right here, it's a little tighter, and it has something to do with the alignment here, because if I kick it, that kind of goes away if I'm turned. Like it's super smooth right there, and you can see it's at the limits, it's kind of bucking. So I think with that little cut on the drive cup, you can get maybe a little further before it wants to buck. But the pin still, gets to the extreme here on one side. So that's kind of the motion there, and you can see the knuckle reacting. So it may not matter, because it may not be that extreme once I get the steering arm on there. It may not be able to turn that far. This diff is quite thick, so that may act as the stop, but I'm about 90% happy with this. But I'm gonna do the same thing on this one. I'm gonna put the shim on the inside. I'm gonna take this apart and widen out this drive cup. This one won't even slot in. It's so tight. It's almost like it got squished. Oh, I got one side in. Yeah, I mean, you can see, and it's catching there at the end, so it would stop it from getting, that full, you can see it was wanting to come to like here earlier. So anyways, another little tidbit here, modification. So just something else to know on these knuckles. They're not super easy. All right, finally have this front axle assembled, and I gotta say I'm happier with this side that I initially had some issues with in the long run. On this full disassemble, and I slotted out this drive cup and reassembled this with the little O-ring shim in there, and this went back together a lot better, a lot snugger fit. I still put some Loctite in here to make sure these didn't come back out, but seems to have really good smooth turning, and I'm not hitting the diff. I'm getting very close. Let's see if I can get a little closer here on this side. So it looks like the diff isn't going to be the stop, and the only thing I have is a little bit of bucking at the extreme. So not bad. It seems to be better, less bucking on this side, or at least turned this direction. I feel like this is all that initial bucking I had. I may pull this and have another go at that drive slot over there. but overall this guy is pretty damn smooth. Can't complain. So I think the front axle is a success. You can see I don't have the servo horn on. I think I'm going to use a plastic one. I've used these servo beasts before and they do come with a nice aluminum horn. It's just shorter, so it kicks your arm up at more of an angle, and I don't think you get necessarily as much throw. So that longer horn sets your bar down here more in the little inset tray. So I'm going to use this plastic one that I cut down and just Sharpie black. So I think that's going to complete the front axle until we get to hooking up and testing that servo. I got the servo horn on there and I was looking at this, and you can see what I'm saying. It keeps it nice and parallel, having that longer arm. But I was just looking at the length of this, and there is a little bit of a toe in. So I might in the future switch to one of the steering links that has the threaded ends, so I can actually unthread those and tow it out, or at least even it up, so you can see if that's aligned with the axle that's kicked in. So if I kind of even them out, they both have a little toe in. Not a big deal, but it's something that's common, that it's not always straight. It may be towed in or towed out, so may swap over in the future, but just something to note there, something to look at. Might affect your overall driving. That looks like a rear axle assembly. So this guy is complete now, looking very nice. No issues with any of the parts. Super smooth, little grease in there, but always much easier on the rear assembly than the front with those portal boxes, because you don't have the knuckles or the steering to deal with. So I did go back and revisit this side, dribbled out that drive cup just a little more, and it didn't really affect the point where it was bucking. It just feels like it bucks a little more on this side than this side, but about the same point. So we'll just see when we get that installed and adjust the steering. But I think for now, I'm happy with the axles, at least independently. So I think we're going to move on. Well, I figured it'd be a good time to take a look at these shocks. So I've got these out here, and these come in a 2-pack. So I've got one opened up. So looks like you've got a couple sets of alternate springs. Looks like my silver one is already compressed shorter than my other silver. What's really neat about these oil-filled shocks that I haven't seen anywhere else is they come with 2 types of aluminum spacers. So it looks like you get 1 mil and maybe, I don't know, these are 2 mil or 3 mil spacers. So these are super nice. Like, I've bought these from Hot Racing before. They're very hard to find, the little spacer kits, but those come in handy. So I think that's due to these shocks being a little bit kind of big bore size, a little wide body. So because of the wider body, you need to space them off of the frame typically, so they're not going to catch. But these did ship with a little bit of oil in there. Not enough oil to be considered oil filled, but just enough for lubrication. So they're not oil filled action yet. They're still pretty springy, but they feel good. They've got a bottom cap. It looks like this top cap has like an O-ring seal. And then you've got your adjusting collar. So yeah, there's a little O-ring in there. That'll focus. But I'm gonna get a little more 30 weight in here, actually fill them. You can see the oil in there. But fill them, bleed them, get these nice and smooth, and then we'll have, I think, everything about ready to assemble. Okay, little shock progress here. Got these fully assembled now with the ball studs in there, and they are flanged on one side, so you want to make sure and get that on the text side at the top. Of course, the bottom, it doesn't matter because those can spin after the fact. Speaking of those bottom spring retainers, you definitely want to use some Loctite. Those came right on off when I was switching springs. And then for springs, you can see I did not use the silvers. Those are the firmest. The ones on the left are the flat black springs it ships with, which are the soft. And then I switched in the mediums on the right. Those are gloss black, it looks like, or a very dark bronze that's glossy. But Gonna have a little bit stiffer spring rate in the rear, but I gotta say overall I'm very impressed with the fit and finish and look of these. These are super nice. They feel really smooth, really nice once I got the oil in there. So I think for now, until we get these actually hung on the frame and get these spacers figured out that we want to use, I think we are finished with the shocks. All right, it is motor testing time. And this is the time in the build that you want to test the motor before you get any drive lines attached to it. That way you can troubleshoot any issues you may have very quickly. So we're gonna hook this up to electronics, make sure the mesh is good, everything sounds good. So to do that, I've got the FuriTech Lizard Pro ESC out here, one of my favorites. Got the Bluetooth dongle so you can control all the parameters from your phone. And we're gonna pair that with the 6-channel FS BS6 from FlySky. So this is nice as well if you're gonna be running multiple lights or switches and you need some extra ports. It is a little larger, but I don't think we'll have any issues in this Gladiator frame build fitting the size of that. And then to control it, we've got the FlySky GT5 transmitter here. So if you're not familiar with this Lizard Pro, let's take a quick look at the spec sheet. So it's nice because it's got a 5-volt or 6.5 volt selectable BEC, and it is pushing 30 amps constant and 50 amp burst. So pretty nice little ESC, super compact. And with that selectable BEC, we can pump it up to 6.5 volts for this servo beast that can handle 7.4 volts. So in the future, I could add an external NSDRC BEC to pump that up to 7.4 to get the max out of it. But for now, we're gonna bind this up, center that servo, test this motor, and move forward. Okay, we are bound up, and I've adjusted a few things on the FuriCar app, but won't be able to do much more until we get it all assembled. So it is nice and smooth, so I'm gonna have to work on kind of the low speed transition. That's the rough spot. But as far as transmission and mesh, everything sounds really smooth, really good. But man, you can see this thing has got some speed, 4100 kV. So it's also got some power though, so hopefully this is gonna work out well being geared down with these portals. And got this servo centered up. I'm not gonna turn it too much because I don't have endpoints adjusted yet. I'm gonna wait until this is kind of on the truck to do the endpoints, but I think for now we can move forward with some assembly. We are just about ready for final assembly. So I've got all the parts and pieces out here. Got a few things we haven't taken a look at. One of those is the links. So these are RC Addiction custom brass links. So I bought these way back when, right when the Gladiator came out, and there were no links and high clearance available. So at this point, I'd probably get name brand since those are quite pricey for the custom aspect of those. But the other item here are the steel drive shafts, and I get these off Amazon. I forget the name. Used them quite a bit, and I just now noticed on these, the star spline of the shafts doesn't line up perfectly, so you cannot phase these perfectly. You can see they're just a little off from end to end. And the short one is too, but not near as bad, just slightly. So I kind of played with that all the way around, and there was no way to phase them perfectly, so that's just a little thing. Hopefully that won't be a big deal with those, but now that I've got all the parts out here, it's probably going to take me a little bit to get this assembled and figure out where I want my link risers on the frame. So I think I'm going to dig into this, and I will be back shortly with a little bit of an update on this chassis. Back with some chassis progress here. So I've got it fully assembled, and man, it was the challenge phase of this build. This was the toughest chassis to get where I wanted it of anything I've ever worked on. I don't think I would recommend this to anybody, this Injora carbon fiber LCG frame for the Gladiator. It seemed to fail in quite a few areas, at least for me. So the rear, let's start at the rear here. So you can see the suspension is heavily modified. So basically they provide you, if you look at the screw hardware down there, that's the stock shock point. So if you come straight up from that, they basically provide you one hole forward of that. So that's not what you want. You don't need all these holes to lean your shock backwards. So that was a fail right there. So I've extended that forward with JLU rear shock mounts, and they've got this little body post extension. So that's what I'm actually mounting through right there with a 16mm screw. So I had 4 of those on hand I had ordered for something else, but just super long. And then I've got that, you know, stacked on 2 of those 3mm spacers the shocks came with to kind of kick that out, and ended up using some aluminum flex blades I had on hand to kick this mount point back further to get more of a lean. And that allowed me to get this all the way up to the full, you know, basically the full usage here of the shock, getting to the frame with the axle, getting the diff right up to the crossbar, so getting everything out of that you can. So that ended up working out really nicely. I did have to kick the shock out even more at the bottom with one of the thin spacers because of the diameter of these shock retainers. They're just so big here. They just ended up colliding with everything. You've just really got to kick them off the frame. Another thing was these bound up really bad if there was any bend along the length. So I took out the outer O-rings on the flange side, so that way these guys can freely kind of lean as that axle articulates and leans. So there's no bind, they're always staying straight. So the rear end ended up working out really nicely in the end. I've got it raised 3 positions here on the link riser. You see they're basically parallel, and you can see those uppers get right up in there in the frame. So I don't think I'll have any collision with this lower angled tray. This upper frame tray I might with these guys, but I believe I'm going to run the battery crossways here, so that'll still work. So let's take a look at the front end here. A little more of a challenge. I couldn't really find a good spot for these shocks. If you used any of these points and leaned them back, it still kind of stopped it, you know, somewhere in here. And these aren't very long shocks at all. These are like 32s or maybe just a hair longer. But what I ended up doing was utilizing that unused slot for one of these trays. So the shock is screwed in at the back of the slot, and then the cross member I screwed through at the front of the slot. So you can see it kind of runs across there. You can see the back side of that slot. So that worked out well, right in front of the motor, right behind the servo, right above the links. The uppers don't hit it. The uppers don't hit the motor. There's no collision on the twist, except for the servo horns on the frame. You can definitely catch on a, you know, if it slides across. So I may end up snipping those corners there where that little upper hole is, get rid of that. I could also look at moving the servo back on this adjustable tray and putting the drag link on the front of the servo horn, and that would get it maybe into this, you know, tucked up area. These look like they're also going to potentially interfere with the bumper mount, but we'll take care of that when we get to bumpers. But I think for now, pretty happy with the overall setup of the frame. The front link riser positions, not the best. As they go upward, they ought to go backwards so you can actually lean this axle. Because at full droop, you can see how much it leans forward. It's kind of level. So if it's at full compression, it's pretty good. But it'd be nice to kind of angle that axle backwards a little bit with those link risers. But other than that, other than all those things, it's not a bad chassis. It's just not a very good chassis. So anyways, wouldn't recommend this. I would go with another brand. Mofo RC has a nice carbon fiber Gladiator frame rail. Used that one on a build. Worked out really nicely. I'm sure there's other brands as well, but I think for now this is going to work out well now that it's, you know, fully set up. But it was a challenge to get here. So I've got to get this tray in, and potentially this one if I can fit it. But but I think the next thing is let's take a look at these inner fenders and rock lights and maybe how we're going to fit those onto this chassis. Okay, let's take a quick look at these Club 5 inner fenders. So I've used these before. I've used the JLU version, adapted those to work on a Gladiator frame. Wasn't too hard, but then now they've come out with actual Gladiator ones that I guess basically are a little bit longer on both fenders just to fit the Gladiator a little bit better. These ship, they're 3D printed, they ship stuck together, so you just need some flush cutters to cut those apart. And very nice finish, kind of like Shapeways quality. Nice stiffness here, and you can see the little rock light bucket. So you get the continuous strand here that you can plug in continuous, or I'm going to switch it, but we'll get to that when we get to the lighting. And then you just screw in next to it with an O-ring to kind of just secure down over the edge of it. But it's pretty simple. I think the install is going to go pretty easily except for the trimming. Of course, I'm going to have to cut out for these shock mount locations that are different. But the screw holes look like they're going to work. The rearward and the frontward share the bumper mount location. So you can see I've got the bracket because I'm going to have to screw into that. I have to get the hinge bracket out because I'll have to back that up. And then this one has 2 more holes. The front one has 1 more hole. And it looks like the front one is there. These 2 I'll have to investigate. Hopefully at least one of these exists on this frame. But hopefully these won't be too hard to get attached, but I think the challenge is going to be just cutting them and modifying those to get the clearance for these altered shock locations. So anyways, I'm going to jump into this and see what I can do. Look at that, we have some inner fenders installed. So I'll go over real quick what I had to do to get these on. Wasn't too involved, just a little bit of trimming. So on the rear, the 3 holes in the inner fenders lined up with the frame perfectly, so that worked out well. I did have to trim the inner fender for this rear screw hole, and then of course I had to pop a hole for that shock mount and spacer there at the top. But that was it on the rears, and that got it done. You can see the aluminum spacer for that shock mount coming through, so it just worked out perfectly. The rear hinge just clears the diff perfectly, so could not be happier with that. One thing I did encounter with installing these, of course, you've got the thickness of the fender, and then that pushes this screw out further, so that was actually catching the shock body. So you can see I ended up adding another thin spacer to the bottom shock mount. So there's 2 that are stacked here to help kick those out, but that gives me nice smooth action side to side. Nothing is catching or binding. So the rear, check, it's done. Super happy with it, getting everything out of it I can. Now the front was pretty much just as smooth on the install. Had to slot the inner fender to match the slot on the frame for the shock mount and that hardware head. I slotted this hole on the inner fender, and that's it. These popped right on there. This other side has a cutout for the ESC tray, so you kind of have to butcher a little more of that for the shock top so it didn't bind, but that's all working now. You can see I added 2 of the thick spacers on the front top shock mounts, and I think those are 12mm screws, but again, that was just to kick that out to get it clear of the fender and the screw heads. And then to match that at the bottom, I installed one of the thin spacers to kick the shock out. But the front is all working except for the side-to-side action. I kind of mentioned that earlier. It's having some issues with the servo catching the frame and the bumper mount. So you can see here on the servo horns, I've actually dremelled those down, smoothed them nice, good transition. The bumper mount I've also modified there. You can see kind of clear for those screw heads, and it looks like I'm good, and I am on the just straight up and down, but you can see how far the servo housing comes forward, so that's still actually catching. So I think the solution will be to use this adjustable servo mount, actually move the mounts back a position, move this whole servo back, put the drag link on the front of the servo arm, and hopefully that'll do it. Looks like there's plenty of clearance back behind the servo to be able to move it back. it'll just ride back over those links a little more. But from looking at it, I don't think I'm gonna affect any articulation at all. So I think that's the next move, is to get the servo adjusted and see if I can get the front just as smooth as the rear. That's the goal. And then once that's done, we can kind of check off suspension, fenders, and chassis for the most part. It sure is nice when you already have the part installed in the vehicle that's going to solve the issue you're having. And that's exactly what happened here. They don't call this the best servo mount ever for nothing. So you can see here, I moved this adjustable mount to that center position, and that pushed that servo back. And I moved this drag link to the front of the servo horn. It almost fit behind it, but because of this thickened brass diff cover, I think the screw head was gonna scratch it, you know, or at least maybe bind with it. But if you had a stock or a thinner brass diff cover, I think you could run the drag link behind it. But this worked out just perfectly. No interference with any suspension, articulation. So let's take a look at the improved bumper mount clearance. So that servo being pushed back now puts kind of the front of the servo box within that clearanced zone. So just works out great. And then as far as side to side and the frame, it just barely kind of can make, like I'm super extreme here pulling this, but I can make contact with the servo ears, but since those are now cut and rounded, it just kind of slides off. So that may or may not happen in a real world scenario, but it's not going to catch. It doesn't really matter. So all in all, I think that's 100% improved in kind of the full flow here, the motion, the front, the back, the side to side. Can I get some 3-wheel motion? There it is. So overall, super happy with that. So I think can move on finally from kind of chassis setup, suspension, servo clearance, fenders. So not sure what's next, but we'll find out. Back with a little update. You can see I've got it all plugged up here. So I decided to go ahead and adjust my front servo. So you can see I've got it centered up now, and you can definitely see that toe in. So I've ordered an adjustable steering link from Injora that's got the threaded on rod end, so I'll be able to unthread those to kick these out and give me maybe just a hair bit of toe out instead of this toe in. But you can hear that beginning of the bucking over there on the passenger side. Driver's side does not have the issue, very smooth. So I think I've got these adjusted at their limits, and that's the speed right now. So I've also ordered a 7.4 volt BEC to pump this up, so that's going to be going in the next stage. But the critical thing that I discovered here when plugging this up, testing the driveline, was a lot of vibration. And initially I thought it was because these drive shafts are slightly out of phase, but it ended up being actually the connection here. It's not a D-hole, it's a circle on these metal shafts, and it's actually loose. So this connection can actually wobble on the output shaft. So let's see if we can see that here. You can see that drive shaft wobbling side to side there. There it is. You can see that connection just flailing. The front's not as bad because it's shorter, but it's also doing it slightly. So just holding it, I can just feel that vibration. Yeah, oh wow, you can see it there. So you get what you pay for. Again, super cheap drive shafts off of Amazon. So luckily, got the stock plastic ones. These do have a D-hole in the end. I don't know if you can see that, but I'm sure everyone's familiar with that, instead of a circle. So I've actually ordered some new metal drive shafts, some stainless ones from Injora that actually have a D-hole, but of course it's Injora, so we'll see those in a couple of weeks. So for now, I'm going to swap these back on, get rid of all that drive shaft shimmy and play, vibration, and then I think we'll be good to move on. Well, I may have spoke too soon. So I swapped in the plastic drive shaft, gave it a test run. I was still getting a little vibration, and what I'm finding is there's movement through the transmission. So you can see this front shaft moving. You can hear a little click. So I think that wiggle is causing that shimmy, because now I've got a tight connection here onto that output shaft with the stock drive shaft. So let's plug it up really quickly and give it a test here. So you can see it's still wiggling. Not getting near as bad vibration, but it's because I'm not spinning a heavy metal drive shaft. But it still has that wobble, so it may be just a little bit of tolerance issue on this little guy transmission assembly. Of course, I haven't swapped that front metal axle yet, but just still trying to troubleshoot this and get rid of that vibration. But I did fully disassemble that transmission and greased it. Everything looked good and smooth. So I don't know if that's anything I can fix in there, or if that's just a little wiggle room in that transmission, but there's definitely some wiggle through there. But may not be a big deal at this scale. Of course, I'm very picky with these kind of things, try to get it all perfect before it's all built. But this may be something I have to live with. But, you know, I'm not feeling it at all by hand right now. There's no vibration. None. So at least took out the vibration. Still getting a little wobble, but just something to know there on the drive line. Just make sure and check that thing. That could cause you some issues. Another quick shot here, just so you can see how extreme this is. Look at that. I don't think I've ever seen a transmission wiggle across like that. It's almost like it just has some tolerance issues in there. So I don't know, I may crack this transmission again, double check all the bearings, but that's a little disappointing. That's a lot of play through there. So anyways, just something to look out for. Okay, well, I pulled out a stock kind of donor truck here just to prove to myself I wasn't taking crazy pills. So let's take a look at this stock transmission and drive shaft. So nice and tight. I'm wiggling it. You can see a little movement through the transmission case there to the front, but not much at all. Very nice connection. You can see there's no gap at the drive line to the actual transmission case. So that probably helps as well, but nice and tight connection, very smooth. And let's take a look at this revised one. So I did get the plastic shaft now in the front and in the rear. Still with this housing, I did disassemble it, double check everything, and I think it's just gonna have a little bit of slop through it. Let's see if I can get that wiggle. There you go, you can see. So a lot better, but it still seems like there's a little more play than with the OEM transmission. But I think it'll ultimately be better than it was and livable now that it's got plastic drive shafts in there. So I'm gonna get it plugged back up. We'll give it a quick spin up and see if that kind of helped with that overall shimmy and vibration. All right, let's do a quick test here, see if this thing doesn't vibrate off the table. Definitely not feeling the vibration at all. Looks like there's still a little movement. But because those drive shafts don't weigh anything, I don't think that's going to be any issue right there. So I think that is finally solved. Going to have at least a drive line I'm happy with. So nice. All right, moving right along. Well, I've got some good news for the build. Little guy was super quick to respond. Get me out a new set of sliders. They said they do not have the gray anymore, so I said black is going to be just fine. So this is the moment of truth here. Let's see if I've got one per side. All right. So I've got that one. And then, oh yes, they are opposites. That is what we needed right there. So I think we're going to get those on the chassis. Looks like I'm going to be able to use the kind of standard mounting holes. Don't think I've got this hole on the chassis. Of course, I don't think it's necessary, but anyways, we'll see. I'm going to see about getting those on, see what they look like. These are going on super easy, very nice. Just want to point out when I'm stacking kind of layers, you know, you're adding plastic layers or fenders, I like to, you know, swap out hardware to something a little longer to kind of account for the thickness of the plastic that you're going to be going through right here. So you can see here, they're cut out to kind of allow for your typical upper link mounts on the frame. But of course, we've got the link risers, and somehow I got them in the perfect positions here, because one lower on either one of those would have been in the way. And then you can kind of see that over here. So they would allow for those lowest positions being the stock ones, but a couple of those up, you know, the ones right up from that, they block. So just be aware of that. It'll limit you a little bit. And then of course I didn't have this rear hole on the frame, but it's not needed. I mean, these guys are super secure on here. So I'm gonna get the other side mounted up, and man, those look really good. Very similar to kind of the flubber stuffers, Gladiator sliders I used on my original build. Really nice. I like that kind of elongated boat side, kind of that kick up at the back. So I think these are going to be really nice. Oh man, these look great. I think they are going to work out perfectly. Just tons of real estate on the sides, down low for mounting options. So that's going to be nice. So of course I had to get the body on there, get a little sense of it. You can see kind of where those fenders sit through there. It's always nice working with a fresh, clear body when you're doing this kind of layout. You can check all your clearances. So let's get a little look here, just kind of at the full compression profile. So nice and tucked on the front, the back as well, and then they kind of flare up to the frame on that inside edge right there, even more tucked. So looks like these are going to work out just perfectly. So very excited about those. So I think now that we've got the body out, kind of got a somewhat sense of what it's going to look like. I think probably need to take a look at some wheels and tires, get those on there, and then check out this overdrive, underdrive, and see how that came out. Finally, we're at my favorite point of the build, wheels and tires. So let's take a quick look at these. So I've got what I'm sure everybody's familiar with here on the right. These are the new ProLine Super Swamper wheel tire sets. Super hard to get a hold of right now for some reason, but I've had these for a while. Weren't originally the tire I was going to put on this build, but anyways, I think they may be a good option. So these are the wheels that I kind of originally had the build idea around using. I believe these are Arsenal V2s. These are WT Micro resin wheels. So these are, as always, super detailed, and they come pre-painted. And you can see these have this scale center cap. So you can see I've got one popped off right here. So you just put on the nut as usual, and then you put that little cap. It just snaps on as a beauty cover on there. So I've also got some Crawler Innovations soft and medium foams. And you may notice I'm missing one tire. That's because I've already got one fitted up here. WT Micro gave me a fifth wheel spare, so I went ahead and got one kind of test mounted, and the tire seems to grab, no glue or anything, grabs really well. That foam really widens this tire out, so let's take a look at it versus the stock. So you lose a little bit of height because you're adding that width, but definitely a little bit beefier looking. And of course these are pretty wide rims right here. I think these are just as wide as his island style. They just have a different, maybe a different offset. They're not as deep dish, but nice deep wide rim, kind of a military mil-spec kind of look to the wheel. But anyways, I think we'll get these mounted up. This could always change from you know, now to the final end result, but I think we're going to mock it up around these wheels and tires, at least get a sense of it, and let's test that overdrive, underdrive. Man, those tires and wheels look really good, but before we kind of look at it all together, let's go ahead and give this guy a little test and see what this Frankenstein reduction overdrive underdrive is going to do here. Look at that. Oh my gosh. That back axle is just barely turning. So how slow can we go? Pretty dang slow for a 4100 kV brushless motor. That is pretty nuts right there. Slow to fast. So that's all working well. All right, so let's get it off the stand. All right, let's take a look at this thing. Man, I think it's starting to look pretty sweet. Definitely got a nice wide stance. You can definitely see this pigeon toe. We're gonna have to get that rectified. But let's see what this thing looks like if I get it kind of where I want it sitting, which is probably a little bit lower. So it's definitely gonna require quite a bit of fender trimming. It'd be nice to keep those, but I can already tell I'm gonna be getting into quite a bit of that fender, the rear as well. If you just look at where you can get, that tire gets almost to the inner fender, so that's a good indicator. I'm gonna have to lose quite a bit of the plastic over fenders, so I think there's gonna be some fun body trimming and planning ahead. Still trying to figure out my paint scheme, so there's a lot of work to come, and of course the scale details and all the added goodies, and the ROCKWOLF Designs custom styrene rack. So I think for now, at this point, since I'm waiting on the BEC, and I've got a lot of electronics, I don't think there's any point to actually getting a full electronics install. I think I'm going to wait till I've got more components to figure out my layout. But I think I did quite a bit of work. Definitely got the chassis to a complete point. So I think from here on out, it's going to be all the fun stuff, scale details and bodywork. So thanks for coming along on this first part of the build, and hope you learned something. I definitely did. Seemed like there was a lot of gotchas in this one. But as always, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for stage 2.